In some ways, it was a day like any other. Molly was scrolling LinkedIn when she got a message from a stranger. This woman, let's call her Dee Dee, introduced herself as a former client of Molly's ex-husband, a man we'll call Mark. Dee Dee was desperate for help, and she wanted to know if Molly would be willing to speak with her. That night, they talked on the phone for 6 hours. Dee Dee told Molly how she'd gone to Mark for therapy, and from the very beginning, he'd started grooming her for abuse. Even in their earliest sessions, he would drop inappropriately sexual comments and then just stare at her, watching her for her reaction. It was very clear that he knew what he was doing, and this wasn't his first time. In fact, at one point, Mark even bragged to Dee Dee about how he'd gotten involved with more than 40 of his clients in the past. This man was a serial abuser. Dee Dee told Molly that despite all that, she kept seeing Mark for 3 years, and she couldn't understand why. Why hadn't she gotten out sooner? Why didn't she just get up and leave after that very first session? But anyone who's been the target of a skilled abuser knows how hard it is to leave. And that's what the grooming process is all about, making you feel complicit in your own abuse. Molly's heart broke for Dee Dee because she'd been harmed by Mark too. It had been more than 30 years since they'd been married, but in some ways those wounds were still fresh. She knew better than anyone what he was capable of, and just how hard he was to get away from. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. My guest today is Molly, a Montessori teacher and an autism resource specialist. She met her ex-husband Mark when she was just 15. Her family was still reeling from the death of her 19-year-old brother, who'd been an all-around golden boy. He'd been athletic, musical, handsome, a straight-A student. His car accident was a tragedy the family didn't know how to recover from, and her parents decided to move them to a new town for a fresh start. When she met Mark through the youth group at their new church, she was immediately attracted to him. He was, on the surface at least, another all-around golden boy, just like her big brother had been.
From the moment I met Mark, I just felt this was somebody my mom would really like. She told me from the time I was little, marry somebody tall, dark, and handsome. Marry somebody tall, dark, and handsome. And Mark was very tall, dark hair, and very handsome. And was very much, I would come to find out, the big man on campus. I met him this summer before my sophomore year in high school. And so I wanted to find out more about this young man. Friends said, Molly, he's not to be trusted. He's a heartbreaker. And I thought, okay, well, good to know. And he was so much like my brother. Star football player, straight-A student, looked like he was going to be the valedictorian of his graduating class. He was a year older than I was. In the fall, my biology teacher pulled me aside and she said, I'm going to put you and Mark together as lab partners. She goes, I think you would be really good for him. And I know he's very interested in you. And I told her, I said, well, from what I've heard, he's not boyfriend material. And she said, but that's where you come in. You can change that. She said, Mark has so much potential, but he doesn't have heart, and you can be the heart.
Her friend's warnings kept playing in the back of her mind. But Molly did enjoy flirting with Mark. There was something intoxicating about being the center of his attention. Meanwhile, her family was falling head over heels for him. But whenever she expressed concern, they encouraged her to keep moving forward. So they started dating, and 4 years later, a few weeks before Molly's 20th birthday, they got married.
My parents and my family members, aunts and uncles met him. The message I got and what people just literally told me, "Oh, Molly, Mark is the son your dad lost." And there were a couple of times I tried to break up with him, and my dad was just crushed. Mark started working for my dad even before we went on our first date. He just infused himself into our family. One time I caught him lying. He told me he was working. I took a different way home from my house, and his car was parked at his former girlfriend's house. And I think it's Maya Angelou who said, "If they show you who they are, believe them." And I always would confront him. When I would catch him, I would confront him. And then it was, "I'm so sorry, Molly, I need you. I want to leave my old life behind, and I need you to help me do that. But I also need you to be patient." 2 months before the wedding, I talked to both my dad and Mark's dad, and I just said, "I'm not ready. I can't do this." My dad just said, "Well, everything's planned and the money has been spent." Mark's dad, who married us, he's a pastor, but he just said, "Molly, everybody gets cold feet." In my wedding pictures, I'm crying the whole time and I'm not happy.
They were both still in college, and their relationship struggled from day one. Molly says it was like a light switch. All the flirting and intimacy, it was gone as soon as they were married. It felt like maybe she wasn't forbidden fruit anymore, so he lost all interest in her. Originally, Mark was in school to work toward a medical degree, but the classes were too hard, so he decided to switch to psychology. Molly says this was never about a calling to help people. It was about wanting to make a successful career. He couldn't hack medical school, but maybe he could achieve a similar kind of salary and prestige through psychology. After college, they moved to California when Mark was accepted to grad school. It was a Christian seminary, and at the end of the 6-year program, he would have both a master's in theology and a PhD in clinical psychology. Mark started seeing clients as an intern before he completed his degree or finished the supervision hours necessary for a full license. And things went off the rails from the very beginning.
When he kissed his very first client in therapy, the husband of the client put through a formal complaint. And that's why the ethics board didn't do anything, because he didn't have a license to take away. But they wrote a very strong letter on how physical contact was absolutely forbidden. And we got into therapy. His therapy was part of the requirement for being in the program. I got to go, paid for by the school, and I was thrilled because there had been enough with an addiction to pornography, kissing a client in therapy. He had problems from the minute we got married. So we got into therapy, and he made sure we got into group therapy, because if you want to be into therapy but hide, you go into group therapy. And one night, the therapist just confronted Mark, and he said, "Molly's been working so hard and doing so well, but you come in here week after week and you play therapist. You're not a therapist. I'm the therapist. And tonight you work." And Mark just said, "Molly, we're leaving." I didn't want to leave. I wanted to just sit there and stay and be safe. And the therapist told me, he said, "Molly, Mark's not going to be back, but I really want you to come back because I really feel like you're in danger if you don't."
So before Mark had even graduated, he already had a formal ethics complaint against him for kissing a client, and yet was still somehow allowed to keep working toward his license. His grad school required students to pursue therapy, but Mark treated his own therapy as nothing more than a box to check, a formality to suffer through until he stopped going altogether. Molly thought maybe therapy could help their relationship, and maybe Mark could start working through his own issues with his mom, but he had no interest in making himself vulnerable in that way.
So Mark never finished his therapy requirement. That was part of his graduation requirement. And over the years, I wondered, did anybody know that? Like, did the therapist who he walked out on because he was being confronted by this therapist, did that therapist ever contact the grad school and say, hey, this guy didn't finish, and I'm really concerned about his wife's safety and about him seeing clients in the future? I can't remember the therapist's name because it was almost 45 years ago. And we were in our early to mid 20s, but I would have loved to have looked up that therapist and asked him if he had ever made a formal complaint. A year later, then, I found out about a second client who Mark had very inappropriate feelings for. I don't know whether there was inappropriate contact, but definitely inappropriate emotional bonds. And the reason I found out about her is because Mark's supervisor held Mark accountable for telling me about her. And this woman was in her mid-50s, early 60s. She was frumpy, depressed, pastor's wife. And it just fit the pattern that Mark had these inappropriate feelings for older women, clients, pastor's wives, depressed. They resemble his mom. And I would point this out to him time and time again. And each time we went back into therapy, Mark was so apologetic. He would take me on, I'm sorry, please forgive me trip. Each time when I found out about his very troubling behaviors and addictions, the gambling, the pornography, inappropriate feelings he had for older women clients in therapy, it was like a piece of the puzzle of who Mark was and why.
Like the first ethics board, Mark's supervisor could see the red flags. He knew something was off with Mark's relationship with his client. And he made Mark confess this to Molly, which is a nice gesture toward accountability, I guess. But the role of supervisor, at least in part, is meant to protect clients. Again and again in Mark's story, we see how easy it is for therapists to prioritize self-protection and the protection of their peers over any real form of oversight and accountability. The problems in their marriage continued to pile up. Molly was alarmed by Mark's pornography habits and his feelings toward other women, and she would eventually learn that he had racked up tens of thousands of dollars in debt from gambling problems. But she never even considered the possibility of leaving him. They were both raised to believe that divorce just wasn't an option, and he could still be so charming sometimes. Whenever a new problem came up, he'd apologize to Molly and thank her for staying with him.
He finished up the hours that he needed, his supervision hours. And so the last thing he needed to do was to pass both the written exam and the oral exam. And the state that we were in, there were just a handful of states that required an oral exam as part of the licensing process. And the state we were in was one of the states that required an oral exam. And he failed it twice. 2 psychologists, the examiners, he sat for the exam twice, so there were 4 psychologists. The things they said about him and how they could figure this all out in a 2-hour exam was amazing. But they said that he was not to be trusted. He missed a classic diagnosis of depression. They felt he would keep his clients far, far too dependent on him, because they were asking questions that were geared to community services, like, how would you help this client heal themselves? How would you help this client become their own therapist? He had no answers for that, but he did great on his written exam. He's brilliant. He's very, very bright. He just said, Molly, those psychologists see me as competition. They were made to jump through the hoops, and now they're just making me jump through the hoops. And he said, we're going to move my dad's ministry and his tri-state Christian radio station. He said, it'll be perfect. I'll be full with clients within 3 months after I hang up my shingle. And then come to find out that state didn't require an oral exam.
The psychologists giving the oral exam can be added to a list of professionals who saw major red flags in Mark before he was even licensed. And they actually really did try to do their part. They asked insightful questions, not letting him move toward licensure because of what those questions revealed. But once again, Mark was able to skirt around the system. So they just moved to a different state, one where Mark's dad's Christian ministry held a lot of sway and would give him a leg up in starting his own practice. In that other state, it just so happened that there was no oral exam required for licensure there. All of the money from selling their house went to pay off Mark's gambling debts. So Molly had to go to her dad and ask for help. She told him about the gambling and her concerns about being 7 months pregnant during such a tumultuous time. But instead of acknowledging the obvious signs of trouble, her dad gave them enough money to build a 5-bedroom dream house out in the country. Molly stayed in their big new house to raise their baby, while Mark's practice, thanks to his dad's name, quickly started flourishing. But the same issues that had plagued them in California followed them to their new state. Mark was rarely home, and soon enough, he found another woman to focus his attention on. An old girlfriend had reached out to tell him her husband had cheated on her, and Mark decided he should be her shoulder to cry on. They started writing letters back and forth and talking on the phone every day. Around this same time, Mark and Molly had joined a Bible study that was reading through a book by Larry Crabb, one of the pioneers of Christian counseling.
We're reading Larry Crabb's book, Inside Out. And one of the characters, or one of his clients that he talks about in one of the chapters, was just the spitting image of Mark in terms of what kinds of addictions he had: pornography, gambling, and sexual partners. And come to find out, throughout the therapy, Larry found out that his father was a hellfire and brimstone pastor, very strict, beat his mom, and his mom had turned to him for comfort in more ways than one. Reading this chapter together in our book study, it's like, this is Mark's story. And the pastor's wife saw it too. And she was a good friend of mine. And she zeroed in on me after the Bible study and she said, "Molly, who does this sound like?" I said, "I know, it's Mark's story." And then she said, "Well, I've been talking to Mark about his inappropriate contact with his old girlfriend. And I'm going to find out further what makes Mark tick." And then I just said, "Better people than you have tried." And within 3 months, they were obsessed with each other. People from our Bible study confronted our pastor. They would so openly flirt with each other. And I would go home so the babysitter could leave, and he would stay and talk with the pastor's wife till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning.
Molly finally found someone else who could see through Mark's carefully crafted facade. Someone who didn't make her feel like she was crazy for recognizing his problems. But then that very same person ended up in his web as just another in a string of affairs. So Mark and Molly decided to give therapy another try. They saw a therapist almost an hour and a half away because Mark didn't want anyone to find out he was seeking therapy. Molly says it was worth the drive because the new therapist seemed great, and she really felt like they were finally starting to make some progress. They were going to a different church, attending therapy together, and they even went on vacation to Hawaii. Then Molly got pregnant again, this time with twins, and something in Mark cracked.
That's when his veneer, this charming, "I'm so sorry, what would I do without you? I wouldn't even be where I'm at today without you, Molly." Then it took a really scary turn where he was saying things like, "I didn't even want 1 child, let alone 3. He just wasn't home. He would finish up seeing clients by 8, 9 o'clock at night, and then he would stay in the office and talk to Karen on the phone, the former girlfriend, till like midnight. And then he'd get up early in the morning and be gone, even though he didn't have his first client until noon. And I was just relieved that he wasn't home. But I went in to premature labor. He just kept saying, "Karen and I are just friends. Karen and I are just friends. You're just so old-fashioned that you believe that men can't have women friends." It was always my problem. It was always something wrong with the way my mind worked. So I hired a private investigator. And the night I confronted him, when I got several videotapes, my water broke on the spot. My in-laws are telling me, "Molly, if any of this gets out, Mark will be ruined, which means you will be ruined. You have a beautiful home. You don't have to work. You can be home with your children. You have a good life. I lived in my big country house and was literally with my 3 children trying to keep 2 of them alive. I didn't leave. And I started getting calls from people saying, you don't know me, but I just want you to know that there is a group of us and we meet every Thursday night for a prayer vigil. And she said, do you know what we pray for? We pray that God will run Mark out of our town.
While Molly was fighting to keep her premature babies alive, word started spreading that there was something seriously wrong with Mark and how he treated women. Molly's sister was urging her to get out, and some of the pastors' wives she was friends with, they were warning people not to see him for therapy, telling them he was a serious womanizer. Molly even received a call from a man who said he'd had a terrible experience seeing Mark for couples counseling. He wanted Molly to know he believed every word that people were saying about him. People started calling to check in on Molly and the kids. Come to find out, Mark had been spreading rumors about her, telling people that she was unstable and that the twins' health issues, well, they were her fault. If the problems in their marriage were going to be public, he needed to shift the blame to her as soon as possible. One of the people checking in on Molly was a colleague of Mark's, and she said she was concerned about their oldest daughter, Emma.
And she said, again, are you and the kids okay? And I said, no. She goes, well, I'm really concerned about Emma, who was 3.5 at the time. Business associate and I were friends. We had dinner together. She and her husband worked for Mark in the private practice in the Christian Counseling Center. And she goes, there's been such a change in Emma. And I said, I know. She's gone from just this really independent, bright, precocious, brave little kid to she won't even go to the bathroom now if I don't go with her. And this psychologist was seeing this and she goes, do you want me to spend some time with Emma? And she goes, the thing with counseling with kids that young, we just take walks in the park and just do it very naturally. And I just started to cry. I said, I would really appreciate that. I don't know what's going on with her, but it's been ever since Mark and she went back to a family reunion. I couldn't go because the babies weren't well. And Mark's mom said, well, Mark, I'll be there. I'll help with Emma. And I think that's one of the first times that he abused her. And she had always known about private parts. And so I talked to her about, Mommy's talked to you about private parts. And I said, it's really important, honey, that if anybody other than the doctor and Mommy ever tries to touch your private parts, you need to tell me. I said, has that ever happened? She said, no. And then she just started to cry. I said, well, honey, what's wrong? And she said, I didn't know, Mommy, I didn't know. I said, what, honey, what? She goes, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to touch Daddy. I never talked to her about touching other people's private parts.
Molly was shattered by this revelation. To think that Mark wasn't just abusing her, he was abusing their child. She was desperate to get Emma some help, and this colleague offering to meet with her seemed like a godsend. But Mark forbade it from happening. He said Emma was fine and didn't need to talk to anyone. Just a brief pause here to remind you, this man is still a practicing clinician. It's worth keeping that in mind as you listen. Molly took the kids out of town to stay at her sister's, and she started meeting with a social worker. After a couple weeks, when Mark refused to seek help and continued to be verbally abusive, she decided to open a report with social services. That was a line in the sand moment. Mark filed a divorce petition, and they both hired attorneys. Molly met with her attorney every week, and she continued seeing her therapist. He said he was concerned about their case going to court. He'd seen too many women lose custody because of loopholes or outright misleadings in the legal process. So a week before the temporary custody hearing, he offered to meet with her, Mark, and 2 of Mark's colleagues, a married couple named Rachel and Sam. They were both practicing under Mark's license until they could finish their supervision hours. The meeting didn't really resolve anything, but Molly left feeling seen and supported. Rachel and Sam shared her concerns, the therapist was on her side, and social services was in the process of documenting Mark's abuse. And the initial meeting with the judge had affirmed how dangerous this situation was. He told Molly she needed to plan to get away from Mark for good if she wanted to keep her kids. So she had every reason to believe that she would maintain custody of her kids.
So the night before the trial, Rachel called me and she said, Molly, you cannot show up in court tomorrow. You just cannot. You are going to lose. I said, Rachel, you were the first one who said that Emma had had this major personality change and that when you mentioned to Mark you were going to start spending time with her, he absolutely forbid it. And you all know about his affair with Karen. You've confronted him on that. You've seen him with her. Social services that's on our side. They have investigated, substantiated abuse, and are kicking it up to a Senate petition, a child in need of assistance. How could I possibly lose? And then she said, because Mark's attorney has coached all of us in terms of what to say. And I said, but that's illegal. That is illegal. She said, Molly, you have to understand. Sam and I will lose everything. We are 3 months away from getting our license. We can sit for the licensing exam because our supervision hours will be done. We will have our license in 3 months. We will help you get the children back. I said, well, I will lose custody by default if I'm not there. And again, she said, you're going to lose anyway. And so I knew the night before the hearing that I was going to lose custody.
The hearing that had seemed almost like a formality now had everything falling apart. When Molly and her attorney got to the court, they realized that the case had been assigned to a new judge. And this judge just so happened to be friends with Mark's dad. Molly didn't have anybody there to testify on her behalf. Even though many people had offered, friends, relatives, neighbors, pastors' wives, her attorney had assured her it wouldn't be necessary, that they'd end up just being a distraction. But now here she was in front of this new judge, feeling very, very alone.
Both the social services investigator and I thought that Judge Samuel was going to be the judge. So my attorney, she told me, Molly, the hearing is slated for an hour. Social services is on your side. Judge Samuel is on your side. The next day I walk into the court and it's not Judge Samuel, it's Judge Anderson, who was a personal friend of Mark's father. At the end of the hearing, Judge Anderson looked at me and he said, I have to ask you, where are the people speaking up for you? The fact that there's no friends or family here leads me to believe that even they believe that you should not have custody of the children.
Meanwhile, Mark had plenty of witnesses lined up to speak on his behalf. She knew at least some of them were well aware of who Mark really was, that he wasn't a faithful husband or a safe father, and he shouldn't be permitted to see clients. But there they were, ready to tell the judge what a great man he was, because they knew a scandal for Mark would be bad for their own careers and reputations. Whether it was incompetence or apathy, it's clear Molly wasn't getting the legal representation she needed. And to make things worse, it turns out the new judge, who Molly calls Judge Anderson, was mired in controversy and was believed by many to be deeply corrupt. Then there was the judge's personal connection to Mark. A while back, Judge Anderson had been badly injured after opening a mail bomb that had exploded, leaving him disfigured. And while he was on what they thought might be his deathbed, Mark's dad helped convert him to Christianity. After he ended up recovering, he continued getting to know Mark's dad and regularly attended one of his Bible studies. This corruption and conflict of interest only compounded the very serious issues that already exist in family court.
That's such a huge part of the problem of parents losing custody of their kids were therapists who were serving as court advocates and court evaluators. And time again, the therapists were putting children in the hands of the abusive parent and not the protective parent. And it was happening to protective men as well as protective women.
As soon as Molly walked in the courtroom and saw the judge, she knew Rachel had been right. She was in deep trouble. She begged her attorney to ask him to recuse himself, but the attorney said that it wasn't an option. If they asked him, he would almost certainly refuse, and then he'd be even more biased against them. So the hearing that had originally seemed like a foregone conclusion was turning against Molly in every possible way. Given all of the writing on the wall, it was no surprise when Judge Anderson ruled against her, and Molly lost custody of all 3 of her children. When she got home, where her best friend was watching the kids, she says it was like something out of the Twilight Zone. Mark was there with his brother and parents, and they were all acting like nothing had happened. They hadn't seen the kids in a while, since they'd been living with Molly at her sister's, and here they were complimenting Molly on how well they seemed to be doing. After a few more niceties, they all started to leave for what Molly would later find out was essentially a celebration party. Their old pastor's wife, the one from the book club who entered into an emotional affair with Mark, was the one hosting a gathering to celebrate the outcome of the hearing.
They all leave. They leave me alone with the children I've just lost custody of. I was the sole caretaker for 4 days after the custody hearing. Mark is nowhere to be found. His mom and dad made it very clear to me that as long as I was quiet and I didn't pursue any further charges or any further work with social services, as long as I was quiet, there was no reason why I could not have custody of the children. I lost them just in basically name only, and that they would make sure Mark got the help that he needed.
Do you see how twisted this is? Nobody, including Mark, actually wanted him to have full custody. They knew Molly should be the one raising the children, and they knew Mark needed help for this very serious problem. They were using the kids as pawns to control Molly, to make sure she didn't try running away with them, and to make sure she didn't do anything to damage Mark's reputation in public. As long as she behaved and kept quiet, she could keep her kids. Shortly after all of this, the long-avoided divorce proceedings finally were underway. Mark told Molly no one would believe her stories. He was too respected, and she was too unstable. He even threatened to sue her for defamation of character, but then he learned about all of the evidence she'd painstakingly been putting together. By this point, she'd even hired a private investigator to video him and Karen entering a hotel room, and he and his attorney quickly started pushing for a settlement. Molly knew a settlement would let Mark off the hook and leave her with more than $100,000 in legal fees. But her attorney argued that settling was the only way to ensure she would get full custody. And then, once that was done, they could move toward a separate lawsuit to help her get that money back. He promised her, take the settlement, get the kids back, and then we go after him with everything we've got. Molly still wasn't sure, and she was trying to read the settlement as carefully as possible. When she neared the last page, her attorney grabbed the contract from her and said, "Don't worry about all that. That's just a bunch of legal mumbo-jumbo about credit cards or whatever. You've read all the important stuff." To make the moment even more dramatic, Molly says all of a sudden a horrible storm started raging outside. It sounded like tornadoes were battering the building. They even lost power. But once the lights were back on, Molly finally relented and signed the papers. It was only later she found out what was really on that last page. An agreement that she wouldn't take this any further, that she wouldn't file any other lawsuits against Mark. Molly met with a judge who told her the settlement was egregious, like something out of the Dark Ages, but it was technically binding. Her only recourse would be to sue her attorney, but this would have been way too expensive for Molly. She was once again failed by the systems that were supposedly meant to protect her. Eventually, the rumors and stories of Mark's misdeeds became so prevalent, he was essentially run out of town. He and Karen, who he married soon after the divorce was finalized, moved to a different city so they could open another private practice. Karen was the office manager at first, but eventually she completed her master's so she could practice alongside Mark. Looking back, Molly wishes she had sued that attorney. She wishes she'd never signed that settlement preventing her from suing Mark. If she had taken that stand and gotten everything out into the open way back then, she wonders if that would have helped her kids make sense of why their family story was so painful. Because even now, more than 30 years later, she can see how those early years affected them. Molly told me she resonates with this quote from the family therapist Terry Real. Family dysfunction rolls down from generation to generation, like a fire in the woods taking down everything in its path, until one person in that generation has the courage to turn and face the flames. That person brings peace to their ancestors and spares the children that follow. Once the dust settled and her legal options were exhausted, Molly knew she needed to separate herself from Mark as much as possible if she wanted to find healing. The kids still went to visit his side of the family, but she's barely talked to him at all in the past 30 years. She joined the movement calling for family court reform, trying to raise awareness about how often vital custody decisions are shaped by both negligence and malpractice.
Once I obtained sole custody of the children, I just knew in the back of my mind that someday I would get involved with family court reform. I started to get very vocal about family court reform and was speaking at some rallies. And Mark followed me one day and approached me at a restaurant that the children and I were at and told me that I was making people in very high places very angry. And I could choose to either be quiet or be dead.
At one point, Molly filed a formal complaint with the state ethics board to have Mark's license revoked. She put together a thorough report, complete with witnesses who could attest to Mark's behavior. She would hear back from the board in just a few short weeks. They concluded that after a thorough investigation, Mark hadn't done anything wrong according to their laws. Molly checked with several of the witnesses that she had named, and they all said they were never even contacted by the board. Which leads one to wonder how, just after a few weeks, how thorough exactly was that investigation? That process, her advocacy work, and the trauma of everything she'd endured were taking a toll. Molly decided to step back from it all and focus on raising her kids. And she was able to create a meaningful career as a teacher and an autism support specialist. But that's not the end of the story. Things took a major turn just a few months ago when Molly got that message from Dee Dee.
A former client of Mark's contacted me on LinkedIn and said that she was in utter turmoil because of her relationship with Mark, and she needed help. And she asked if I would talk with her. And I called her, and we spoke for 6 hours. I just felt like I didn't have the help and the support that I needed at the most devastating time of my life. And I just felt like I had to help this woman.
Dee Dee told Molly her story about how Mark had been sexually inappropriate from the very beginning, about how he had bragged that he had gotten involved with at least 40 other clients in the course of his career. Remember, this is the same man who went before an ethics board before he was even licensed because he had kissed a client. Is it any surprise that there would be dozens of other violations if he was allowed to keep practicing? Hearing Dee Dee's story lit a fire under Molly. She started reading up on family court reform and learned that very little has changed in the last 30 years. She went back to therapy for the first time in decades so she could work on making sense of everything she'd been through. And she is determined to tell her story, to do everything she can to prevent others from being harmed by Mark. I would like to thank our guest today, Molly, for your bravery in reaching out to share your story. I know it's not without risk. Thank you. And thank you to our incredible writer, Bo Denton, for crafting such a compelling narrative for this episode. Your talent and dedication truly bring these stories to life. If you have found value in today's episode, please consider leaving us a rating and review. Your feedback helps us to learn and grow. If you'd like to share your story or support someone else in sharing theirs, you can reach out to me at podcast.psychotherapy@gmail.com or connect with me on Instagram at podcast.psychotherapy. And I hope you'll join us next time.